of people who went against the grain.
It was crucial to their future to be in the classroom.
We're actually safer as a result of being in school.
Courageous Leadership Through Crisis. Live from the Blue Bear Cafe, this is Voices of Courage.
We are back here with our team in Mount Airy City Schools filming a podcast. I have some great friends on here who were state leaders during the pandemic, and I just felt like it was really important to include their voice as voices of courage. North Carolina was one of the states that responded really quickly to get superintendents what they needed. The folks you see on this call helped to get the General Assembly, DPI, the governor, and superintendents on the same page. And if you can believe it, it happened. Never are they all on the same page. So I call this a miracle working team. DPI worked really closely with Jack Hope, too, who I have to mention, with North Carolina State Superintendent Association. And we all had the common goal of getting kids back in person. We were lucky enough to be the first district to bring them back 5 days a week. And we celebrated that, but it was really difficult. Catherine Truitt came in a little bit later. Mark Johnson was the superintendent here at that time. So I'm just taking you kind of back to that time. Dr. Stegall was the deputy superintendent of innovation. Bev Emory was the deputy superintendent for district support. We also have Freebird, who was a liaison between the General Assembly, the state board. He was a former North Carolina Teacher of the Year. And thankfully, I knew all of these three folks during that year so that I could call them, email, text them. The superintendents really depended on this group. So thank you guys for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
It is an honor.
I'm so glad your voices entered this Voices of Courage group, because I really do believe you were voices of courage. Let's go back to a little time that none of us really want to remember in detail. Take yourself back to 2020. COVID had hit the schools. We were shut down overnight. We went to spring break and never came back. And then the first time we were back in, it was a completely different world. Online learning was a pivot, delivering meals, technology to homes, providing support for families, taking care of educators and staffs. You guys remember that. So can you talk about your role during that time, how the team pivoted? What made you all so much a voice of courage, even though you didn't realize what you were going to have to do? You all three were determined to do it. Can you kind of talk about your roles during that time and maybe that early time of the pandemic and what that felt like in Raleigh?
I could jump in first if you would. My role was largely determined because I answered the telephone. The true story. So on March 14th, the week leading up to March 14th, we had districts on spring break. We started hearing about cases in a few districts, and the department we were being asked what to do. Should we send students home? There was lots of uncertainty. And that Friday when Bev and I and Freebird went home for the weekend, still not knowing what things might look like. Saturday morning, I got a phone call early on. I think Bev probably got called first because she has more answers than I did. And I think she was unavailable but anyway, I answered the phone and they asked me to come to Emergency Operations Center. The governor was calling a press conference, and because I happened to be there, he said, we're going to have these guys, we're shutting down. I think at the time it was a 30-day stay-at-home kind of order. And what we learned real quick, my first call was, Bev, help. And what we learned real quick is that people like Bev and Freebird and lots of people stepped forward. But you also had people that you learn in leadership. Some people are frozen by the moment. The people on this call were not frozen. They said, we have to be the support. We got to figure it out. We have none of the answers. It was so encouraging to see that we went from, I just happened to be at the press conference to, 24, 48 hours later, there was 50 people working on response from our department. Bev, you may remember much more detail, but I just remember that it happened so quickly. And She and I and others at the department and Freebird and Stegall, there was a group that just said, what can we do? And it happened quickly and people mobilized. It was encouraging.
I would add, I don't know, probably it was the morning walk or workout, and I blessedly missed that phone call. It kind of made David the point person, but I want to point two things in that period of time. David mentioned the week leading up, we were getting a lot of calls, concerns, obviously news media. And Dr. Vanessa Wren was one of my directors at that time. And Vanessa and I started talking that week about what we didn't know was coming and what could be useful. And I just want to give a shout out. I think those of us on the front get a lot of the credit, but that team in digital teaching and learning went probably 3 days without sleep. And you all may recall on that Friday, the 13th, we had a webinar and they lifted up the new website, which was our first step. I mean, it was the backbone of support. And none of us, I think, at the moment realized the power of it, of having something already built that people could go to when we knew we weren't coming back to school. The other point I wanted to make was, and Kim, you mentioned this, but the willingness of people to do, and for some of us to step in and be heard. And I feel so grateful looking back that, you know, people who didn't really know us that well from DHHS and other agencies just immediately relied on the strength and talents of people at the department. And that Sunday that David's talking about, 2 points I would just make about courage. One, we were muddling around getting ready to meet, and you all have heard me tell this story. Jessica Swinsky just got an award for this from the North Carolina School Public Relations Association. But I said to Superintendent Johnson, we are not going to get through this without communications help. We have to have help. And he was like, do you know someone? I said, yes, I do. And he said, well, make it happen. And I mean, that make it happen attitude with these people here, also across the agency. I think the thing I will always take with me is that bond of whatever it takes, you know, we will make it happen. And that Sunday afternoon, Kim, we stood up a phone call out of that emergency management center with every superintendent across the state. That was the beginning of that constant communication. And so just a shout out also to Jessica, because she was sort of the wind beneath the wings in the comms part of this that was critical, and still should be, as what I call pandemic. We might be in 3.0 right now, dealing with post impact. But the other point quickly is, you know, the Department of Public Instruction often had not the greatest customer service reputation. And when you spend your whole career in the field, as all of us did, and we came into the department into roles at, you know, relatively the same time, what you learn quickly is those division directors are incredibly talented people. And we didn't have to go tell people. I mean, you don't have to tell a Lynn Harvey what needs to be happening, or a snake. I mean, these people, they deployed, you know, they've done hurricanes and they've done other crisis kinds of things. So it was really easy, in my opinion, to bring a team together with those kinds of folks on it.
Yeah, Freebird, you want to round this question out?
Yeah, there's a quote by Margaret Mead that just always comes to mind when I think about this. And it goes, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And when I think about that quote, I think about the pockets of small groups of citizens who are committed and dedicated to bringing our state through this and to transcend the impact of COVID. And, you know, we've highlighted some names. The directors were just incredibly responsive. And they're such experts in each one of those pockets that we had to work with. You know, Dr. Harvey, when it came to child nutrition, that was one of the first real focuses that we realized, is that we had to make sure that our kids were fed, that we had buses running that could get that food, that we had individuals committed to making sure that our students were fed. We talked about Dr. Wren and her team, and how we realized very quickly we were going to have to pivot on how we were delivering instruction and making sure that we were communicating and had opportunities to reach out to our students. You know, Sneha's name was mentioned. Like, I could go through and just think about these morning calls. Every morning we had a call that Jessica would pull together, and all those small groups of concerned citizens and committed individuals would meet, and we just walk through the previous day, and then we'd plan for the next day. And it was just step by step. I can't overemphasize the messaging and the communication impact. And you know, Dr. Morrison, I think that was built on the back of all of the relationships that these individuals had already built over time. And I think that's the strength of how you transcend something like this, is that we had individuals who had, I mean, COVID point 3 for some of our districts is COVID point, 3 back then, because they had already weathered the storm through multiple hurricanes. They had middle schoolers who had not gone to school for a consecutive year. So that they were built to take on this challenge and to lead. And when you pull that kind of strength together in our roles, we had a responsive group, a committed group of concerned citizens who are ready to answer and respond. So I couldn't echo their sentiments more about, just the multitude of people that brought all this together.
Great. So the trend we're talking about in this podcast actually builds on the previous podcast, and you guys have all mentioned those trends. This one was like, how were you all really quickly flexible and responding to data? And the previous trend was, how do you build a network of support? Mm-hmm. And so you've talked about how you had to flip quickly and everybody was willing to do it. I think that's your why. They all had a similar why. That's what I find for educators and health professionals. They both stepped up when everyone else stepped home. Like, everybody went home, we came to work because of our why. And then right after that, we had to build this network. You talked about, all of these different groups you'd never talked with before. We just finished a couple of podcasts with some epidemiologist at Duke University who I didn't know really well, but of course we know really well now. And it was because Dr. Benjamin and that team from the ABC Science Collaborative was a team I had to access. So you think about leaders, right? The what you're talking about with following your why, showing up when everybody else freezes, building your network of support, your team who had expertise in areas that you don't have. What a great lesson for leaders as they go through crisis, because now we believe we have a mental health crisis. Statewide, there is a mental health crisis, which is in response to COVID. It is not the school's responsibility to own everybody's mental health, but we do have to do the best we can so that they can learn. So once you've built that network, which you guys did, and you all were all voices of courage, this networking is not easy for new superintendents or new principals or new leaders to really do. And you guys were all new at one point somewhere along the way. And Freebird, you jump in on different teams, so you have to build new partnerships a lot. I know you all helped across the state before. How do you think we need to build our network now to face this mental health crisis? Let's start with Freebird on this one, and just talk about, if you were talking to a new leader, how do they build a network to make sure that we can support students and staff who are struggling in mental health crisis, when that's really not our expertise, but we need to help them as much as we can so that they can flourish in our environment?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons that we all learned from this, and you highlighted this at the very beginning, and kind of jokingly said, it's not often we get everybody on the same page, right? Is we initially have to find that common ground. And I think that the crisis provided an opportunity for us all to find common ground. We had to transcend this. There was no other way to face this crisis than getting through it and making sure that our students were fed, were able to communicate, had academic opportunities. The mental health crisis that we're facing right now, we've got to figure out, like, what is that common ground that we can all build upon and have very, simple points of agreement. And then we start to face this problem, I think, from a multitude of lived experiences and perspectives, because we actually have districts right now all over the state that have built initiatives and built programs, and they're doing incredible work in facing this crisis. That was another thing that I think we learned, is the regionalization of how districts were facing this crisis, particularly in COVID. But then as we transcend and look more at social, emotional learning and mental health, looking at how those districts are coming together in a specific reason and facing this challenge. So I would say those are two ways: find that common ground that we all agree upon, and then begin to build in solution, asset-minded, problem-solving ways. But then also look at what districts are already doing, learn from them, and look at how we can adapt that at a larger scale.
Yeah, what a great point to look at people who are leading on this initiative and taking lessons from them, so you don't have to learn those lessons again. Bev, you have anything you want to add to that?
I'm gonna jump here because I think David can elaborate, but I want to lift up something he did, and it's part of your "what would you say to new leaders." Months before, David started his deputy role in June, and I started mine in July of 2019. And we inherited these structures or systems of how you meet with your directors. And other than sort of the business part of the house, most everybody reported to the two of us. David comes to me, I don't know, August-ish, and says, "Bev, what if we took one of these meetings a month and we brought all our directors together and we met jointly?" And I thought, brilliant, we started doing that. And what I would tell you is we didn't have any major product or outcome. We spent the time getting to know each other. What are our big problems? It was team building, I guess, David, and you can elaborate here. But what I look back and see is divine about this idea he had. That was the platform that launched this work. Those joint meetings turned into subgroups where we added superintendents, and it created an infrastructure, a very intentional infrastructure. And so my recommendation to new folks would be, how do you cross collaborate, cross team, make sure everybody understands the roles of others and what that impact is? And then what is your intentional system in place, for nurturing that? Because especially with mental health, this happens on the bus. This happens in a classroom. You can't not have sort of a big picture around what your strategy is going to be. But I want to say it was the brilliance of Dr. Stegall in this joint. No, it was. He didn't know a pandemic was coming. It was the commitment to collaboration and what we might be able to do together that really laid the foundation for what we did.
Well, and I will say all three of you are very similar to me in that you build teams, you collaborate. That's how you lead. That's important for new leaders to think about. So, David, you had to pivot very quickly and come up with a solution in an area you weren't familiar with. It sounds like it was from your core of building healthy relationships as we do this. You want to talk about, kind of respond to what Bev said there?
Yeah. So I'll speak quickly. This goes back to my time as a principal and even as a district superintendent. When I became a superintendent, I knew right away I had the seat at the table with the key decision makers and with board, but I wasn't in charge. I had to make sure everything was aligned, but I knew that the people with the expertise were all around me. And one of the first things I did as a superintendent was say, there are people outside of our district and our buildings that have answers to every problem we have. We got to find out who those people are. Let's connect with them. And we spent months going to other districts to find out what people like you, Kim, were doing, and all the way to Onslow County up to the mountains. We went everywhere to find out what what was working and how we can make it work on our own. And to Bev's point, it's essentially what we did at DPI, and it continues today with the Promising Practices Initiative. So I say to new leaders, be vulnerable. I think there's confidence people have when their leader doesn't pretend to have all the answers. They want you to succeed. They want you to be, because if you succeed, they succeed. So you can be vulnerable. But with what we're dealing with mental health, it's okay to say, I don't know what the answers are. Who's doing this well? Who can help me? Having empathy is vital, because we don't know what someone's story is, and we need to make sure that we have empathy, understanding that we're all dealing with something. We're carrying that around with us. But that connection, that promising practices, learning what others are doing well, sharing, I think that's how a strong society works, when we're willing to lift each other up and learn from one another, that collective capacity that's so vital. So I think that regardless of the situation, as a leader, you don't have to have all the answers. And to be honest, you're probably not the expert in most anything you're talking about, but they're in your buildings. Every building, every leader has a Bev Emory or a Freebird that's on the staff. Freebird was a teacher. Bev was a teacher. They're in classrooms right now. Teachers that are going to be the leaders 20 years from now are teaching English in 4th grade. So be willing to make yourself vulnerable to ask, who can help me? Who can help us? I have the voice at the table, but it doesn't mean I'm the one that's the smart one. And once you get past that, the answers start flowing through a lot quicker when you get out of your own way.
What a hard lesson for new leaders to learn. You're
It
not in
is.
charge. Even if you are in the seat, you're not in charge.
Nope.
You only can influence. And
Yep.
then sometimes you can't influence, someone on your team has to influence. The quicker you let go of the fact that you have control, the better. Because
Yes.
what I find, just like you guys are saying, not only vulnerable, which came out in the paper with every leader, they were fearful, they were scared, they were worried. They had to tell their staff, I'm afraid. Like, it's okay. Like Kathy Moore said, I had one COVID case in all of Wake County, and we shut the entire school down, the whole system, because we were afraid. And you have to be transparent, not only vulnerable, but to say internally, I'm struggling right now. And mental health is the same way. Like, you guys are all like that, because I know you and I've known you for years. You're very much out there. People can read you like an open book. But a lot of people hold that really close to the chest, and it eats at them, right? When they think they're in charge, they think they're in control, and they tend to lead that way. They need to let go of that and really be vulnerable, build a great team. You do have a seat at the table for a certain period in your life. Use that for children. Use that for good. Use that for your staff. So our schools, whether they were going virtually or in person through this difficult time, really in large part to all of us kind of stepping up and the educators showing up every day, we have found that there's a lot of staff that are struggling right now. I'm working with Ricky Robertson and about 10 districts around the state to do this piece. And number one, mental health support has to be with the adults in the schools. Once they are okay, then the children will begin to be okay, because we take care of ourselves. This is a really hard one. Bev, I'm going to let you kind of take the lead on this first. How can educators and leaders take care of themselves when they're going through a crisis? How will this self-care affect their ability to lead others?
Oh, you hit my sweet spot, Kim. Why does a woman who's 65 and retires go get her certification as a personal trainer? I can't say enough, and have been collaborating a little bit with Brian Kreisman, who is focused, if you all know, totally on superintendent well-being. And it's sort of like in the South, you all have heard, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And, we have to start with ourselves. And I think sometimes we have this fiction that we can preach to everyone else, but if we're not modeling working out and walking, and, one of the things I've been trying to do is, and Kim knows this, especially with women leaders, is create those hacks that make it easier to do those things even on the job. Come walk with me while we meet. David and I did a lot of business walking through schools and visiting, or board member, if you'll come ride with me and sit through the baseball game, we can handle this. How do we build movement and care sort of into our daily routines. And I think the start is us, and we have to bring a healthy, joyful self to work. When people see we're okay, it's motivation, right? If you're all, oh my God, I want to eat, I mean, it doesn't work. And I think the other part of that is very intentional care of your staff and lifting them up and checking on them and knowing them. Those personal relationships are everything. And sometimes we take for granted that we're busy and we don't check on people. My retirement job is, how I need to text 5 people a day. And I do. I mean, you can ask around. I check on, and sometimes it's just, hey, hadn't talked to you in a while. How you doing? But it means something to people. And I think it's my small way in retirement of trying to contribute to this whole issue. But we can all do that. It doesn't take 3 minutes to check on 5 people a day. I mean, it's simple.
And Freebird, you're so negative, never positive, not a cheerleader. Most people that know you're always positive, but I bet there's sometimes you've been down too in your career. So, how do you help people? Because you really do find joy in everything you do. Every role that you've had, even, working with politicians, you found some joy. How do you do that, Freebird? And how do you give advice to those of us that need a pick-me-up sometime just to come to work every day? Because, we are making a difference, but sometimes we forget.
Yeah, I just had an incredible opportunity to go and lead a week at NCAP, and at every week we go to the Ocracoke Lighthouse, and I tell this story to the teachers about how the lighthouse became the symbol that we used in our communication and messaging when we were transcending the impact of COVID. It was lighting our way forward, and the lighthouse does 2 things. It's a symbol of hope, right? For the ships that are coming in, when they see that lighthouse, they know that they're close to the shore. But it also is a symbol to remind the sailor that there is danger, and they've got to be cautious, and they've got to be, on their toes. And I think about what powers that lighthouse. For many years, it was the oil drum at the base, and when that oil drum is empty, we cannot do either. Lift up and provide that symbol of hope, or provide the warning of danger coming through. And as a philosophy teacher, I would always work with my students on the Stoic happiness triangle. And it's a very kind of simple philosophy. It's centuries old, but it's literally, you take control of what you can take control of and change, but you have got to let go of that which you cannot. And I mean, that's such a hard but simple philosophical life lesson. But I think for us, as educators, there's no better way to look at a classroom and realize, like, I can change what I can change right here in this classroom and work with these kids, but there are things that are outside of my control at the moment. And I think that's just such a valuable lesson for us to learn. But believe me, there are moments where mornings when I wake up and I look in the mirror and I have to choose happiness. And I think we all deal with that. Happiness isn't just, this natural intrinsic thing all the time. We have to choose it, and we have to decide, like, how we're going to use this day and impact change and do it for our students and our children, and ultimately in our roles for our state. And I think those are just some simple lessons that just kept me going. And I love the symbol that we use in the lighthouse because it's such a powerful North Carolina metaphor. But what a beautiful daily reminder of who we can be as a lighthouse leader, but also what that takes, the fuel that takes to keep us going.
Just reminds me, what Bev and Freebird both remind me of, is that you don't have to be a superhero. I think sometimes we think that we have to be everything to everyone, and leaders, and really everyone, teachers, everyone in education, you have to be able to self-advocate, to say, I need to step back for a moment. Can someone else lead? Can someone else cover this? Is it imperative that I have to be in charge in this moment, or that I have to be, we overschedule ourselves, for example. Is it imperative that I have to work 15 hours today? and we feel like we have to show that we're willing to be the first one in and the last one out. And there's some validity to that, but we also have to self-advocate that for my own personal and mental health, I need to be able to go on a walk for 30 minutes. I need you to cover this for me. Or, I need to not have today scheduled in the morning. I need time to decompress. There's nothing wrong with self-advocating. And in fact, strong leaders have to push to self-advocate because you will always be asked to do more and more. So don't be a superhero. You don't have to be all things to all people. Just keep that in mind. And people certainly understand that you're human. So, and as Bev has said, she was one of the best models of anyone I've worked with. You show it and people start mirroring your activity. So you start doing those things to take care of yourself. They model what you do, or they replicate what you do. They mirror what you do. So just make sure that you don't put your staff, your people that you're working with, those that you supervise, don't put them in the spot that they themselves become vulnerable to mental health strains.
Yeah, and I think the whole point of, so many points you just made. Build joy into your schedule, like schedule.
Yep.
Schedule your morning walk. For me, it's like scheduling going to the pre-K classroom. Having been a band director, I've been going and watching the new band director here, who's excellent, and listening to how great the band program is sounding and growing. That's something I can build into my day. Also, taking a half a day sometimes with a colleague to go out together to look at the things you've accomplished together as a team, right? So take your deputy superintendent and say, remember how this was a couple of years ago? Let's go walk through it and think about how far we've come. You have to self-affirm your work because no one else may know that work you did, but you guys do. Very similar to what you all did when you led the state. Only a few people really know what this team did, and all of those in Raleigh. So as we close out, one last word from each of you. We'll start with David. What would you tell a new leader who finds themselves in the middle of crisis? What should that leader's self-talk be as they're getting ready to go through this crisis? Another way to ask that I asked in the paper was, what would you tell your former self at the beginning of the pandemic, knowing what you know now? It's a similar question. What does this new leader need to be having constantly in their self-talk head? And we'll start with David.
Well, what I kept falling back on is we all have it in us to be great, and others are depending on me. And Bev and I struggled. I hate to speak for other people, but we talked about this quite a lot, that we had survivor's guilt, that we had been in those seats in the superintendency just a few months before, even maybe a year plus before ourselves. And that you have self-doubt when you think, man, could I do what they're doing right now? And I hate that they're going through some things that I didn't have to. I feel guilt, but just know that we have greatness in us. But again, as you heard me say multiple times, we don't have to do it alone. Lean on others, grow, have people around you, surround yourself with people that both make you better and that you can get better from learning, teaching them and learning from them. So that reciprocal relationship. So don't do it alone. And you have greatness in you. You wouldn't be in the position if others didn't believe you, and they put you in that seat for a reason. So no, fall back on that. I have it in me. I have that self-efficacy that I can do this, but I don't have to do it alone.
Yeah. Bev, you want to jump in there?
It's a beautiful question. The first thing that comes into my mind is look at your own children. All of us have kids, and whatever the crisis is, after all these years, I always looked at it as either the kids I'm serving don't have a mama like me, like my kids do, and need them, or they're my kids and they deserve the best I have to give them. And so I can do this because that's what I'm doing. That's why I'm here. That's why I've invested this. And I think sometimes just focusing on your own family and saying, if they were in this crisis situation, what would I want for them? What would I want the outcome to be? Because my kids, whether it's 2 or 54,000, deserve whatever I can give them to walk through this fire, whatever the fire of the moment is.
Yeah. So I came into that role. I started March 1st. in that role. And so very, very quickly when March 13th came, I remember Cecilia Holden, who was my mentor at the time, saying, you're going to have a lot of time, Freebird, to adjust to this role because General Assembly session doesn't start until, April or May. And I quickly realized that there was one simple mantra, and it's allow people the opportunity to be the hero of their own story. And that starts from the kid in the classroom all the way up to the top level leadership. Is that everyone has the opportunity to be the hero of their own story. And if everyone looks at their actions and their decisions and their responsibilities with that mindset, imagine like what we can accomplish. And that's ultimately what we did as an entire state. We can look at some gaps and some challenges and how our students were learning, but overall to transcend something that no one really had any experience in, no one really had any solutions at the time when this broke, for them to begin to see themselves as a hero of their own story and transcend that, whatever it is in their personal individual lives, in their roles, but then as a state public education system, I think that's just a simple mantra that I always keep close to the chest is if you provide opportunities for people to be the hero of their own story, it's going to be an incredible epic.
And I think, you have to have leaders understand the Esther story. Maybe you were called in those new roles for a time such as this. You realize you find yourself in a role you didn't know you were going to be in. It really was fortuitous for you to be in those roles. And so that's what I always tell new leaders. You are the person for the job. You're in the role. It is you. And then the courage you have to dig deep for, which each of you stood up to that role and you dug deep for the courage. You didn't go away. You didn't quit. You didn't move roles. You stayed in it. And then now we're going into a new crisis. But in education, there's always a crisis, right? So we want leaders to know that there's a lot of joy in that. You have great relationships coming out of it, and you can look back and say, we impacted an entire generation of children. So thank you so much for being on here today, my friends.